You know, folks, I want you to sit with me for a minute because what happened this morning, March the 23rd, 2026, is one of those moments that looks simple on the surface but carries consequences most people haven't begun to think through. President Trump went on Truth Social this morning and announced in all capital letters that he's postponing military strikes on Iran's power plants for 5 days. 5 days. He called the conversations with Iran very good and productive. The markets jumped, oil came down, and a lot of people scrolled past it and thought, well, good, maybe this thing is cooling off. Now, look, I hope it is. I genuinely do. We're talking about a war that's been raging for over 3 weeks, that's killed thousands, disrupted the global energy supply worse than anything since the 1970s, and has our allies in the Gulf getting hit by missiles they never asked for. So, if there's a real opening for peace, I want that more than anybody. But here's the honest truth, and we'll come back to this in a moment. When one side announces productive talks and the other side says those talks never happened, that's not diplomacy. That's a press release. And when the most consequential decisions about war and peace are being made through social media posts, something has gone very wrong with how America leads. I've been in that chair. I know what it's like when the clock is ticking and millions of lives hang on what you do next. And I can tell you the clock doesn't care about your tweets. It just keeps ticking. And right now we've got 5 days on that clock and not nearly enough clarity about what happens when it runs out. Now, to understand why these 5 days matter, you've got to understand what led us here, because none of this happened in a vacuum. Go back to June of 2025. Israel and Iran fought a 12-day war that shook the entire region. Then in January of 2026, massive protests erupted inside Iran. The nuclear question was coming to a head. And here's the part most people don't remember. There were real negotiations happening. Oman was mediating. There were rounds in Muscat and then Geneva in late February. And the Omani foreign minister, B. al-Busadi, a man I have enormous respect for, said publicly that a breakthrough had been reached. Iran had reportedly agreed to zero stockpiling of enriched uranium and to convert its existing material into fuel. That's not nothing, folks. That's a significant concession. And then on February the 28th, 2026, while those talks were still warm, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, massive coordinated strikes across Iran. They killed senior leaders, including the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. His son Moshe was appointed to replace him on March the 8th, and Iran responded the way anyone paying attention knew they would. They closed the Strait of Hormuz, launched retaliatory strikes across the Gulf, and the world's energy supply fell off a cliff. Now, let me tell you something from experience. When I was president, we understood a fundamental rule of diplomacy. If you blow up the negotiating table, it's very hard to build a new one. The IEA has called this energy disruption worse than both 1970s oil crises combined. 11 million barrels a day gone, oil above $100 a barrel, gas prices up 17%, Gulf allies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain getting hit by Iranian missiles they never signed up for. And all of this flows directly from a decision to launch strikes during active negotiations where a breakthrough was reportedly within reach. That context matters. And we'll come back to that because it explains almost everything about what happened today. All right, let's walk through exactly what happened step by step, because the details here are everything. On Saturday, March the 21st, President Trump posted on Truth Social that if Iran doesn't, and I'm quoting, fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours, the United States will hit and obliterate their power plants. That's an ultimatum aimed at civilian energy infrastructure. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. Iran's Defense Council responded immediately. They said if the United States attacks their power grid, Iran will retaliate against energy and water desalination facilities across the entire Gulf, and they will mine the sea lanes to permanently shut down shipping. Now, these desalination plants are not abstract targets. Countries like the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, they depend on those plants for drinking water. No desalination means no water. That's a threat to millions of civilian lives. Then this morning, Monday the 23rd, right as the 48-hour clock was about to expire, Trump posted again all capital letters saying there had been very good and productive conversations over the past 2 days and that he was postponing strikes for 5 days. Now, here's where most people stop reading, but here's where it gets important. First, Iran's Fars news agency, which is linked to the Revolutionary Guard, said there has been no direct or indirect contact between Iran and the United States. Iran's foreign ministry went further, formally calling Trump's announcement an attempt to, and again I'm quoting, reduce energy prices and buy time to implement his military plans. Second, behind the scenes, it appears Turkey, Egypt, Oman, and Pakistan were passing messages. These were not direct U.S.-Iran negotiations. Third, the White House did not respond to questions about who participated or where these talks took place. And fourth, oil prices dropped over 13%. Brent crude fell from above $112 to $96. Stock futures surged. And this is where things start to get complicated, because when one side says we're talking and the other side says we're not, that's not a negotiation. That's a press release. Let me tell you something, and I say this not as a partisan, but as someone who spent 8 years making decisions where the wrong call could cost lives. Diplomacy by ultimatum is not diplomacy. It never has been. Think about what happened here. The President of the United States issued a 48-hour ultimatum on social media to a nation he is actively bombing, threatening to destroy their power plants. Then, when the clock was about to run out, he announced productive conversations that the other side flatly denies took place. And he extended the deadline by 5 days. All of this conducted through Truth Social posts written in all capital letters. Now, I managed the 1994 North Korea nuclear crisis. We were staring down a regime that had plutonium and was threatening to use it. I can tell you every negotiation I was ever part of that actually worked had one thing in common. Both sides had to be able to say yes without losing face. That's the most basic principle of conflict resolution. When you issue a public ultimatum and then publicly claim talks are happening, you make it impossible for the other side to confirm those talks without looking like they caved. That's precisely why Iran denied the conversations. Not because nothing was said through intermediaries. Maybe something was, but because acknowledging it publicly would mean Iran accepted Trump's framing, and no sovereign nation under bombardment is going to do that. I also want to speak honestly about the target itself, power plants. We're talking about civilian infrastructure that keeps the lights on in Iranian homes, that powers hospitals, that runs water systems. The BBC has documented strikes near hospitals and schools already. UNESCO has confirmed damage to at least 4 cultural heritage sites, including the Galastan Palace. 168 people were killed in a single school strike. When you threaten to obliterate a nation's power grid, on top of all that, you're not pressuring a regime. You're punishing a people. And I want to be very careful here. Iran's behavior is unacceptable. Closing the Strait, striking Gulf neighbors, threatening water infrastructure, that's all real. But leadership means owning the chain of escalation you helped create. And that change started on February 28th, when we bombed the country we were in active talks with. Now, we've got to talk about something that goes beyond this one moment, because what's happening here is not just a foreign policy question. It's an institutional question, and it should concern every American, regardless of party. Start with Congress. This war was launched without a new authorization for use of military force. The House debated a war powers resolution in early March. There was a real serious constitutional argument about whether the president had the authority to launch these strikes. Speaker Johnson called it dangerous to limit the president's authority. But the Constitution is clear. The power to declare war belongs to Congress. And right now, 5-day pauses and 48-hour ultimatums are being announced on a social media platform. not through the institutional channels that exist for exactly this purpose. When I sat in the Oval Office, the process wasn't there to slow me down. It was there to make sure the decision was right. Then look at our alliances: Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain have taken Iranian retaliatory strikes. Their desalination plants, their energy infrastructure, their civilians are in the crosshairs. And yet the strategic direction of this war shifts with each social media post. Oman's foreign minister wrote in The Economist that this is an unlawful war and a grave miscalculation. That's an ally, a mediator saying publicly what others are saying privately. When your partners can't trust the process, they start making their own calculations. And that's when coalitions fracture. And then there's the diplomatic infrastructure itself. The Omani-mediated talks that were reportedly close to a breakthrough were destroyed by the February strikes. Now we're told that indirect messages through Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan constitute, quote, productive conversations. That's not the same thing. That's like saying, because your neighbor told your cousin that you might be willing to talk, you've reached a deal. The institutions of diplomacy, back channels, confidence-building measures, verified intermediaries, written frameworks, those exist for a reason. They create the architecture that makes durable peace possible. Governing by announcement erodes that architecture. And once it's gone, it's very hard to rebuild. Now look, I want to offer you a different way to read what happened today, and I say this respectfully because I'm not trying to be cynical. I'm trying to be honest. Follow the market, not the missiles. When Trump posted his announcement this morning, the reaction was instantaneous. Brent crude dropped from above $112 a barrel to 96. That's a drop of over 13% in hours. Bloomberg reported oil futures tumbled 14%. Stock futures surged worldwide. The Dow jumped over 1,000 points in futures trading. Indian markets saw a massive spike. The dollar fell against major currencies. Every single financial indicator moved in one direction: relief. Now I want you to ask yourself a question. The 48-hour ultimatum was about to expire. There was no clear plan for what obliterating power plants would actually achieve strategically or diplomatically. Iran had explicitly promised devastating retaliation against Gulf energy and water infrastructure if the strikes happened. The global economy was already bleeding. Gas prices were up 17% since the war began. And the IEA had called this the worst energy disruption in half a century. In that context, what was the cost of following through on the ultimatum? It was enormous. And what was the benefit of announcing a pause dressed up as diplomatic progress? It was also enormous, at least in the short term. I'm not saying the markets are running the war, but I'm telling you, when an all-caps social media post moves oil prices by 13% and stock futures by 2%, somebody in that White House noticed. And when Iran's own foreign ministry says this was about reducing energy prices and buying time, you have to at least consider that they may be reading the situation accurately. Responsible leadership would acknowledge this tension openly, that economic and political pressures played a role, rather than dressing up a strategic pause as a diplomatic triumph. The American people deserve that honesty, and frankly, the markets deserve it too, because relief built on false premises doesn't last. So where does this go? Because 5 days is not a strategy, folks. It's a countdown, and we need to think seriously about what happens when it reaches zero. Let me walk you through the scenarios. The first and the best is that real talks produce a framework, some kind of ceasefire, some opening on the Strait of Hormuz, some pathway back to nuclear negotiations. I want that. Every reasonable person wants that. But here's why it's the least likely. Iran formally denies that talks are even happening. Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, hasn't been seen publicly. CNN reported no proof of life as of 3 days ago, just a statement read on state TV. The fundamental demands are miles apart. The U.S. has talked about everything from denuclearization to regime change, and Iran wants the bombing to stop. Full stop. And Israel's role is entirely unclear. If you think Benjamin Netanyahu is sitting quietly while someone else decides the pace of this war, you haven't been paying attention. He said just days ago that the war created conditions for regime change and suggested ground troops might be needed. That doesn't sound like a man ready for a 5-day diplomatic window. The second scenario is the most dangerous. The pause expires, and the strikes on power plants happen. That would plunge 88 million Iranians into darkness. Iran has explicitly said it would respond by destroying Gulf desalination and energy infrastructure and mining the entire Gulf. The humanitarian and economic consequences would be catastrophic and potentially irreversible. The third scenario, and I believe the most likely, is rolling extensions, repeated short pauses, vague claims of progress, the war continuing at lower intensity while economic pressure builds on everyone. This creates the worst of all worlds: ongoing destruction, no clear endgame, eroding alliances, a global economy hemorrhaging, and an American president governing a war through 5-day increments announced on social media. That's not leadership, that's improvisation. And in a conflict this consequential, improvisation gets people killed. I want to close by stepping back, because this isn't really about one true social post or one 5-day window or even one war. This is about what kind of country we are. I've never pretended that Iran is easy. It's not. The regime has been a destabilizing force for decades. The Strait of Hormuz must be open. Nuclear proliferation must be prevented. I don't minimize any of that. But the way a democracy wages war and pursues peace says everything about what it stands for. And right now I'm troubled by what I see. We launched this war during active negotiations where a mediator said a breakthrough was within reach. Congress was sidelined. No new authorization, no formal debate before the first bombs fell. Cultural heritage sites, schools, and hospitals have been struck. More than 2,000 people have been killed. 13 American service members have died. Our Gulf allies are absorbing retaliatory strikes they never asked for. And the most consequential decisions about escalation and de-escalation are being made through all caps posts on a social media platform. America at its best doesn't do this. America at its best builds coalitions before it fires missiles. America at its best exhausts diplomacy before it sends young men and women into harm's way. America at its best doesn't announce ultimatums on social media and then call it a victory when it grants itself an extension. But here's what I still believe, and I say this after a lifetime in public service. America is capable of course correction. We've done it before. After Vietnam, after Iraq, in moments when the country looked honestly at what had gone wrong and chose a different path. This 5-day window, whatever its real motivation, could still become an opening for genuine diplomacy if it's handled with seriousness, humility, institutional rigor, and respect for the human lives at stake on every side. But 5 days goes by fast, folks. And the question isn't just what happens on day 6. The question is whether we still have the moral authority to shape what comes after. Because moral authority isn't something you can announce in all caps. It's something you earn through restraint, through honesty, through respect for the institutions that make democracy possible. And right now, that's what I'm asking all of us to fight.